We all know the New Testament has grand miracles, like raising the dead or walking on water. But have you ever stopped to think about the practical, strange details? Imagine transforming 180 gallons of water instantly, or a venomous snake being shaken off without harm. Tonight, we drift into the quieter, stranger moments of the strange miracles of the New Testament and more. In today's video, we'll talk about the colossal wedding miracle at Cana. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. We begin our quiet journey in the dusty, sun-baked village of Cana in Galilee, where an ordinary, essential celebration, a wedding feast, unfolds with all its attendant chaos and joy. In the tightly packed homes and courtyards, the most fundamental social contract was hospitality, and to fail in providing for one's guests was a profound and lasting public disgrace. Amidst the rising laughter and the clinking of cheap pottery, a subtle catastrophe was unfolding, the kind that whispers of shame rather than shouting of disaster. They had run out of wine. This was not merely a temporary inconvenience, but a genuine crisis that threatened the honor of the newly joined families, marking their union with the bitter stain of poverty and unpreparedness. It was here, in the midst of this most human and relatable of dilemmas, that the first strange miracle of this narrative unfolded with quiet domestic efficiency. 6 massive stone water jars stood nearby, intended not for daily drinking, but for the necessary and meticulous Jewish rites of purification before meals. These jars were vast containers of rough-hewn stone, each capable of holding 20 or 30 gallons, meaning the total vessel capacity was a staggering 120 to 180 gallons. Think of the sheer, quiet logistics of this transformation. Nearly 200 gallons of common, cool water, without fanfare or visible effort, became vintage wine. The central figure gave a simple, direct instruction to the servants, men whose only role was to obey, telling them merely to fill the great jars with water to the brim, a seemingly ridiculous task in the face of the wine shortage. They did so, hauling bucket after bucket until the heavy, cold stone vessels were completely full, standing ready as silent witnesses to the unannounced change. The master of the feast, tasting the first drawn cup, was completely oblivious to the transformation's origin, merely noting that the host had inexplicably saved the best wine for last. He was puzzled by the reversal of custom, where the cheap wine was usually served first, after the senses were dulled, and then the lesser quality followed. The wine's quality was therefore immediately and publicly affirmed by the most qualified palate present, confirming the transformation's depth beyond a mere change in color or taste. The servants alone knew the secret of the water-turned wine, their knowledge a silent, shared wonder among a few laborers at the periphery of the party. It was a miracle accomplished far from the spotlight, primarily to shield a newly married couple from a lifelong social embarrassment, demonstrating immense power used in service of quiet dignity. The great volume of wine ensured the feast could continue in abundance for days, preserving the family's honor and cementing the joy of the guests. The immediate, localized effect of this transformation, its immense scale hidden within the familiar containers of the purification ritual, is what makes the tale so peculiarly compelling. We consider the feeling of the servants as they drew the clear, flavorless water and then tasted the smooth, rich wine, recognizing the impossible without needing to explain it. This miracle of water into wine was an act of profound and abundant physical provision that solved a critical domestic and social need. The immense logistical provisioning of this single wedding sets the scene for a grander, more public act of multiplying food in the remote, desolate wilderness. We transition now to a place where hundreds, not dozens, needed immediate and miraculous sustenance. The wedding's need for honor is replaced by the crowd's desperate need for basic survival. We leave the stone jars behind to consider the immense physical presence of thousands of people gathered far from the nearest marketplace. This contrast of quiet domestic abundance with challenging public scarcity will define the next story we explore. The logic of infinite wine now gives way to the paradox of the small bread basket. We turn our attention from the intimate setting of a single wedding feast in Cana to a vast, desolate hillside in the remote region of the Sea of Galilee, where the scale of human need exponentially increased. A tremendous crowd, conservatively numbered at 5,000 men, not counting the countless women and children who also followed, had gathered to listen and learn, forgetting the basic necessity of providing for their own hunger. As the day declined toward evening, the sun casting long, cool shadows across the scrubland, the disciples approached the central figure with a practical, almost desperate anxiety. This was a wilderness. The hour was late, and all these people had nothing to eat. Their suggestion was the logical course of action in the first century, a simple logistics problem. Send the multitude away. Let them scatter into the surrounding villages and farms to buy food for themselves. A solution rooted entirely in human effort and finite resources. The master's response, however, was a quiet and impossible instruction. You give them something to eat. This command immediately highlighted the vast, undeniable disparity between the enormous need and the utterly negligible means at hand, drawing attention to the very paradox that was about to unfold. The disciples, seasoned and weary, could only muster a pragmatic lament, calculating that 200 denarii, nearly 8 months of a laborer's wages, would not be enough even to provide a small piece of bread for everyone present. It was the young boy who unwittingly provided the initial data point for this staggering equation, offering up his entire simple lunch, 5 small barley loaves and 2 modest fish, a meal barely sufficient for one person, let alone a throng of thousands. These loaves were not the substantial, large rounds we might imagine, but small, flat, biscuit-like cakes often shared during travel, underscoring the pathetic insufficiency of the offering. Yet, it was this humble, utterly inadequate starting point that became the pivot of the entire narrative, forcing everyone to confront the material limitations of the world as they knew it. The sheer organizational difficulty of feeding such a mass was immense, a logistical nightmare, even if catering had been an option. Gathering, preparing, and distributing food to thousands of people spread across a rough, uneven hillside would typically take an army of servants and many hours. Instead, the command was given for the people to sit down in orderly groups on the fresh, deep green grass, arranging them into manageable companies of 50s and 100s, a pattern that brought calm and structure to the chaotic crowd. The arrangement itself was a small, preliminary miracle of order and patience, allowing the disciples to see and count the multitude they were about to serve, forcing them to reckon with the impossible tally. The distribution began with a simple act of blessing, a thanksgiving over the small offering, which was then broken and given to the disciples to distribute among the rows of expectant people. We can visualize the weary disciples walking the long lines of seated figures, starting with a basket that contained just enough for a handful of people, only to find the bread and fish mysteriously replenishing itself with every passing row. The process must have been slow, methodical, and profoundly strange to those carrying the baskets, a seemingly endless cycle of breaking, sharing, and finding more to give. There was no theatrical moment, no visible source of supply, just the steady, inexhaustible flow of food into the waiting hands and mouths of the multitude. They ate until they were completely satisfied, a critical detail that transforms the event from merely addressing hunger to providing total, abundant fulfillment far beyond a simple ration. And then came the final, most peculiar detail, the act of collecting the surplus, a command to gather up the fragments that remained, that nothing should be wasted, an instruction that shifts the focus from the immense provision to the evidence of its sheer magnitude. The fragments were gathered into 12 full baskets, one for each of the disciples, a powerful and undeniable symbol that the excess of the miracle exceeded the entire original supply by an astonishing amount. The very existence of those 12 baskets of leftovers provided a quiet, physical, and countable testament to the abundance that had poured out of nothing just moments before. The multitude dispersed as the sun set entirely, their hunger satisfied, carrying with them the memory of the inexplicable meal, leaving behind the empty hillside, save for the 12 disciples now burdened with their heavy, overflowing baskets. This profound abundance, this sudden, overwhelming provision of physical necessities in the middle of a wilderness, naturally transitions our focus to the domain of the unpredictable, volatile elements of nature itself. We move from a quiet miracle of material provision on solid ground to a startling display of control over the terrifying instability of the open sea, seeking a different kind of sustenance, reassurance in the face of fear. The immediate aftermath of the miraculous feeding found the central figure insisting that his disciples depart from the crowd and cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he himself remained behind to dismiss the vast, lingering multitude. As the boat pulled away from the shore, the disciples found themselves alone, propelled into the deep darkness of the night and the immediate rising resistance of the weather, a stark contrast to the perfect order and tranquility of the meal they had just witnessed. They were seasoned fishermen, men who knew the fickle temper of this particular lake, understanding that the deep bowl of the surrounding hills could channel sudden, fierce squalls without warning, turning calm water into a churning tempest in minutes. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze earlier, now beat against the boat and the sail, forcing the disciples to strain against the oars, making little progress against the sudden, relentless surge of the waves. Hours passed in this futile, exhausting struggle. The rhythmic pull and push of the oars against the water serving only to emphasize their isolation and their growing weariness as they remained miles from the shore. The deepest, most desperate part of their ordeal occurred during the fourth watch of the night, the period stretching from 3 o'clock in the morning until dawn, the absolute nadir of human wakefulness and the height of the sea's nocturnal terror. It was in this moment of deepest physical fatigue and existential dread that they perceived a strange sight in the darkness. A figure approaching the boat, walking on the water as if it were solid ground. The vision, appearing through the spray and the heavy gloom, was so counterintuitive to everything they knew about physics, nature, and the limits of the human body that their minds immediately interpreted it as a phantom, a spirit haunting the deep. A cry of terror, born of sudden, absolute fear, and the knowledge that they were far from any human help, rose from the beleaguered boat, shattering the rhythm of the waves and the wind. The reassuring voice cut through the noise, a calm and immediate command. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Instantly grounding the terror with a familiar and undeniable presence. It was Peter, ever impulsive and fiercely devoted, who spoke up first, demanding a command, a confirmation that he, too, could momentarily defy the gravitational pull of the earth and the destructive force of the water. He received the simple, non-negotiable instruction, "Come." A single word that required an immediate leap of faith out of the security of the boat and onto the unstable, dark surface of the sea. For a few heart-stopping moments, Peter achieved the impossible, standing upright and taking several genuine steps across the surface. A fleeting miracle witnessed only by the frantic figures in the boat. But then the wind, loud and physically imposing, and the sheer visual size of the terrifying waves reasserted their physical reality, tearing Peter's focus away from the source of the power. Immediately, the law of gravity and density reasserted itself, and as his confidence vanished, the solid water turned back into the yielding element, causing him to sink into the cold depths with a panicked cry for rescue. He was immediately seized by the hand, lifted out of the water, and received a gentle, quiet rebuke. A question about his little faith that centered not on his action, but on his sudden, momentary doubt. As the two figures stepped back into the relative safety of the small boat, the immediate, astonishing side effect occurred. The chaotic, violent wind completely dropped, and the sea, moments ago, a terrifying maelstrom, instantly became still. The silence that descended upon the water must have been profound and unsettling. A sudden cessation of elemental noise that emphasized the absolute authority of the one who had commanded the sea. This miracle was not only a grand display of power over the physical laws of nature, but was deeply personal, offering a terrifying and immediate lesson to the disciple who had dared to momentarily defy those laws. The passage ends with the disciples' collective, hushed astonishment and their realization that this figure commanded the very waves and the wind, elements that defied any human control. The instability of the dark, heaving water and the power displayed over it naturally leads us to consider the solid-rooted earth and the unexpected display of power over its most mundane and seemingly indifferent life forms. We shift from the chaotic, open elements to the silent, predictable cycle of a tree's growth and bearing fruit, setting the stage for a strange, instantaneous intervention in the natural world. Our scene shifts once more, moving away from the volatile sea and the intense emotional dynamics of the disciples to the mundane, everyday sight of a solitary fig tree standing by the roadside on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It was early in the morning, the air still cool and crisp, as the central figure and his disciples were walking from Bethany toward the great city, a quiet, contemplative journey before the day's inevitable confrontations. A sudden, ordinary hunger prompted the figure to approach the tree, which, from a distance, promised refreshment because it was fully covered in leaves, a visual suggestion of abundant fruit. The sight of full foliage in a fig tree was the ancient promise of figs, as the fruit typically appears on the branch before the large, easily visible leaves begin to fully unfurl. However, upon closer inspection, the promise was empty, the leaves hiding no delicious clusters. The branches were entirely bare of any edible fruit, a silent deception of natural appearance. This was a peculiar disappointment, made more significant by the detail that it was not the season for figs, an observation which immediately introduces a layer of confusion to the act that follows. We must consider the fact that fig trees do produce small, early forerunners before the main season, and if the leaves were already out, one would reasonably expect to find these small, edible knots. Finding nothing, the master pronounced a short, chilling sentence against the plant, a quiet curse of cessation. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. This was a deeply unusual display of immense spiritual power used not to heal or provide, but to immediately and dramatically enforce a consequence upon a piece of non-responsive vegetable life. The disciples heard the words clearly as they passed by, a quick, almost throwaway command in the early morning stillness, and they continued their journey into the city without giving the matter further thought, focused on the weightier issues of the temple and their mission. It was not until the following morning, when they returned along the same road, that they rediscovered the scene and were forced to confront the strange, overwhelming power of the spoken word. The disciples were utterly astonished to see the fig tree, which had stood full and green only the day before, had now withered completely from the roots up, a sudden, total, and irreversible decay. The decay had been instantaneous in its onset, not a slow, visible process, but a profound death that had somehow reached deep into the hidden root system overnight, killing the entire living structure. Peter, remembering the quiet sentence of the previous morning, was the one who drew attention to the startling sight, calling out in shock, "Rabbi, look! The fig tree you cursed has withered." This dramatic, instantaneous destruction of the tree served as a profound object lesson for the disciples, revealing a silent, terrible power to control the life force of the earth itself. The lesson given was not about the tree, but about the overwhelming power of simple faith and prayer, connecting the mysterious fate of the plant to the disciples' own spiritual potential. The power displayed here was an inverse miracle, not one of life-giving abundance, but of rapid, utter decay. A shocking reminder that immense authority encompasses both creation and unmaking. The withering of the fig tree, a symbolic act of power over the silent, persistent process of natural life, now naturally leads us to a miracle concerning the decay and restoration of the human body. We shift from the dried-up, lifeless roots of a plant to the profound, living suffering of a man afflicted with a gradual, terrifying bodily death. The unexpected end of vegetable life sets the stage for a long-awaited and instantaneous restoration of human health. We move now from the perplexing demise of a fruitless tree to a scene of profound human sorrow. The interior of a household paralyzed by the ultimate loss, the death of a child. The central figure in this domestic tragedy is Jairus, a man of high standing, a respected ruler of the synagogue, whose life of public piety and structure had been violently fractured by the sudden, relentless illness of his 12-year-old daughter. The number 12 is significant here, marking her as standing precisely on the threshold of womanhood, ready to transition from childhood to marriageable status, amplifying the gravity of the loss in that ancient, tightly structured society. In his desperation, this man of authority had humbled himself completely, falling at the feet of the wandering teacher in public, an act of profound social risk for a man in his position, pleading with a voice thick with fear and a father's unbearable grief. As they journeyed toward his house, a slow, winding procession through the busy, distracting streets, a devastating messenger arrived, speaking the final, heart-stopping words. "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" The stark, blunt finality of this pronouncement served as the official closure on the matter, signaling to all onlookers that human hope and medical intervention had reached their absolute, uncompromising limit. The central figure's immediate response was not a grand pronouncement or a burst of dramatic energy, but a quiet, sustained instruction aimed solely at the stricken father. "Do not fear, only believe," a command to maintain faith, even in the face of verifiable, undeniable death. When they finally arrived at the ruler's house, the chaos of ceremonial mourning had already begun in earnest, filling the air with the piercing, professional wails of flutes and the loud, ritualized lamentations of hired mourners. This was a noisy, public performance of grief, dictated by custom and designed to announce the death to the entire community, signifying that the soul had departed and the finality of the tragedy was in motion. The house was crowded with people, family, friends, and the hired professionals, all fully committed to their roles in the drama of death, creating a wall of sight and sound that the visitor immediately sought to disperse. The master allowed only the girl's parents and his 3 closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to pass through the throng, isolating the event from the skeptical public eye and the theatrical noise of the professional mourners. Upon entering the room where the girl lay, the quiet figure dismissed the wailing crowd with a gentle, confounding assertion. "Why do you make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping," an observation that drew immediate, scornful laughter from those who knew the indisputable, cold reality of the situation. Their laughter, rooted in certainty and fact, only served to underscore the truth of the girl's demise, highlighting the almost absurd, counterintuitive nature of the words spoken by the one who sought to intervene. He then performed the simplest, most human of acts, taking the child's cold, small hand in his, an action that completely disregarded the cultural taboo against touching the dead and the associated ritual impurity it incurred. The two simple Aramaic words spoken over the silent form were Talitha cum, a diminutive and tender phrase meaning "little girl, I say to you, arise," a soft, domestic command of revival. The effect was instantaneous and absolute, not a gradual awakening, but a sudden, life-affirming return of the spirit into the small, frail body, evidenced by her immediate ability to stand up and walk around the room. The astonishment of the parents was a quiet, private moment of overwhelming joy and confusion, a silent realization that the unchangeable fact of death had been utterly reversed in the confines of their own bedroom. Yet, the miracle concluded not with a sermon on resurrection, but with the most mundane and tender of instructions, a command to give her something to eat, an observation that the restored life needed immediate, practical nourishment. This final detail, the acknowledgement of a child's simple hunger, contrasts the grandeur of overcoming death with the humble, essential reality of the living body, grounding the supernatural in the domestic. The parents were strictly commanded to keep the event private, to avoid the immediate rush of sensationalism, emphasizing that this powerful act was primarily for the relief of the family, not for public spectacle. This quiet, deeply personal reversal of death in a private room, marked by a gentle command and the simple need for food, leads us naturally into another story of quiet, deeply personal healing achieved by a secret touch in a dense public crowd. We transition from the peaceful sleeping child to the hidden, chronic suffering of an adult woman seeking salvation in anonymity. We find ourselves now returning to the bustling, densely packed streets, where the crowd, having witnessed the initial journey to Jairus' house, presses in from all sides, creating a suffocating pressure against those at the center. Amidst this thick public throng was a solitary woman carrying a terrible, invisible burden, a crippling, chronic hemorrhage that had plagued her body for a relentless 12 years. This span of suffering is notable, matching the age of the girl who was just raised from death, creating a strange, quiet parallel between a life cut short and a life protracted in misery. Her condition, defined as an issue of blood, meant that she lived in a constant, devastating state of ritual uncleanness according to Mosaic law, forcing her into a lifelong social isolation, where every touch, every shared object, made others unclean. The practical implications of this were immense, requiring her to live apart, barred from all public worship and communal life, turning her into a perpetually untouchable ghost within her own society. Beyond the crippling isolation, her relentless search for a cure had drained every last resource, every piece of wealth she possessed, leaving her financially ruined by the constant stream of doctors and ineffective treatments. She had suffered many things from many physicians, the remedies likely crude, painful, and costly, ultimately serving only to exacerbate both her physical ailment and her profound despair. Driven by a desperate final hope and constrained by the fear of causing ritual impurity, she resolved upon a silent, stealthy approach, determining that if she could simply touch the hem of his garment, she would be made well. The garment in question was likely the outer robe, specifically the ritual tassels or tzitzit attached to the corners, which held deep religious and symbolic significance, representing the law and God's promises. We can visualize her moving through the dense press of the crowd, using the physical chaos as cover for her secret mission, her fingers reaching out through the layers of cloth and bodies toward the unassuming fabric. The moment of contact was quiet and brief, a mere brush of her fingertips against the consecrated thread, yet the effect was immediate and overwhelming. She instantly felt in her body that she was healed of her terrible affliction. Simultaneously, and far more mysteriously, the central figure felt a distinct, palpable drain of power leaving him, an awareness of spiritual energy being transferred out of his body into the unseen recipient. He immediately stopped the forward momentum of the crowd and asked a confounding, public question that brought all movement to a halt. Who touched my clothes? The disciples, frustrated by the interruption and the question's apparent absurdity, pointed out the obvious, that the immense crowd was pressing in on him from all sides, making the identification of a single touch impossible. But the master persisted, looking around with a purposeful intensity, knowing that this contact was different, a touch born not of curiosity, but of intentional, focused, and utterly silent faith. The woman, trembling with a mixture of immense relief and profound fear over her revelation, came forward, fell down at his feet, and confessed the whole truth of her suffering and her sudden, secret cure before the entire crowd. Her confession transformed the stealthy, anonymous healing into a public testimony, revealing the long duration of her social and physical burden to all who had failed to notice her suffering for 12 long years. The response she received was not a reprimand for her stealth or a demand for payment, but a comforting pronouncement that validated her belief. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. The entire episode emphasizes the power residing not in the fabric of the garment itself, but in the desperate, total commitment of faith that drove her touch through the human barrier. This miracle, so intensely personal and achieved in secret, yet ultimately revealed to the public, was a restoration of both body and social standing. This quiet restoration of touch and acceptance naturally flows into a story about a public yet profoundly complex sensory restoration achieved through an unusual tactile method. We shift from the secret touch of a garment to the strange application of common earth and saliva for a healing that is witnessed by all. Our journey now leads us through the bustling city of Jerusalem and toward the temple grounds, where we encounter a man whose entire existence was defined by a single, permanent, and original deficiency. He had been blind from birth. His lifelong darkness made him a fixture of the city streets. His identity inextricably linked to his daily practice of begging, relying on the charity of those passing by to sustain his humble existence. The disciples, observing this man, initiated a theological discussion, asking their master a complex speculative question about the cause of his condition. Was this affliction a punishment for the man's own sins, or for the sins of his parents? This question reflected the common ancient belief that severe physical suffering must be directly traceable to a specific moral or spiritual transgression, tying personal tragedy to divine judgment. The answer received was a complete dismissal of that premise, an assertion that his blindness existed not as punishment, but as a deliberate state, a canvas upon which a greater work was to be displayed for all to observe. The unique process of healing that followed was perhaps the most deliberately strange and multi-staged of all the miracles. Beginning with a deeply tactile and unconventional action, the master spat on the ground and then kneaded the resulting mixture of saliva and dust into a thick, gritty clay. This clay, this unction of earth and human moisture, was then deliberately and carefully applied to the blind man's sightless eyes, coating them in the wet, dark mixture. An act that must have felt rough and profoundly unsettling to the recipient. The instruction given immediately after this tactile application was a simple, yet geographically specific command. Go. Wash in the pool of Siloam, requiring the blind man to undertake a further necessary journey across the complicated, uneven terrain of the city. We can imagine the difficulty of this task. A sightless man navigating the crowded, noisy streets, his face smeared with the unusual dried mud, guided only by the sound of his own shuffling steps and the whispered directions of others. The pool of Siloam itself was an ancient, essential reservoir fed by the Gihon spring via a tunnel, its name meaning scent, creating a silent, symbolic connection to the instruction given. The man went, obediently followed the instruction, and washed the rough mud from his eyes in the cool, deep water of the reservoir. A simple, physical action that precipitated the sudden, overwhelming miracle. When he emerged from the pool, the darkness had vanished completely, replaced by the profound, startling reality of light and color. He returned to his familiar street corner, no longer blind, but now possessing the ability to see the world for the very first time. His neighbors, and those who knew him best, the ones who had witnessed his daily begging for years, were utterly confused and deeply divided, unable to reconcile the beggar they knew with the newly sighted man before them. They questioned him intensely, forcing him to repeat his story of the clay, the washing, and the instant sight, a simple narrative that stood in stark contrast to the complex theological and legal questions it raised. The focus of the subsequent controversy, however, quickly shifted from the miracle itself to the legal technicality of the Sabbath, since the mixing of spit and clay was interpreted by the religious authorities as a form of work strictly forbidden on the holy day. The man who was healed found himself dragged into an intense, aggressive interrogation by the Pharisees, forced to defend the legitimacy of his cure against their rigid adherence to the law. He, a lifelong beggar with no formal education, found himself debating with the highest religious authorities, utilizing a simple, unassailable logic. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. The final, quiet conclusion of the miracle was the man's expulsion from the synagogue for refusing to deny his healer, in exchange of physical darkness for social isolation, though he now walked in the light. This complex, multi-stage restoration of the man's lifelong sensory deficit, achieved through mud and water, leads us directly to the story of a man instantly made able-bodied after decades of physical paralysis. We transition from the confusion over a restoration of sight to the astonishment surrounding a man instantly able to carry his bed, defying the long, heavy burden of time and chronic illness. We move now through the ancient, crowded lanes of Jerusalem toward the great, five-sided structure near the Sheep Gate, a place known as Bethesda, which means House of Mercy, a name that was often tragically ironic for those who gathered there. This was a complex of porticos, a series of sheltered columnar walkways surrounding a central pool. Its architecture designed to offer shade and sanctuary to the scores of sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed people who lay scattered upon the stone pavement. The very atmosphere of the place was heavy with the collective despair of chronic illness, the quiet rustle of linen mats, and the low, persistent murmur of those endlessly waiting for a miracle that rarely came to them. The reason for this eternal vigil was an old, desperate legend held tightly by the community that at certain, unpredictable intervals, an angel would descend and physically stir the waters of the pool, and the very first person to enter the agitated water immediately after the stirring would be cured of whatever ailment afflicted them. This belief created a daily, agonizing proximity to a fleeting, unreliable source of healing, generating a frantic, hopeless competition among the most physically incapacitated, none of whom could move fast enough to claim the promised prize. Among the dozens of hopeful, suffering figures lay a particular man whose predicament was defined by the sheer weight of time, a paralytic who had been waiting and hoping near this very pool for an almost incomprehensible duration of 38 long years. Imagine the psychological burden of such a vigil. 38 years of watching others, of hearing the sudden splash of water, of knowing he was always too slow, too heavy, too dependent on the assistance of others who were likely too busy scrambling for their own cure. He lay perpetually within sight of the supposed remedy, yet always denied it by the very nature of his own paralysis, a constant, agonizing loop of near misses and dashed hopes. The central figure of our narrative approached this man, noticing him among the many, singling him out not by his desperation, but by the undeniable evidence of his long, intractable suffering, marked by the dust and wear of decades. The master did not ask about the legend of the stirring waters or about his faith, but posed a direct, almost challenging question that cut straight through the man's paralysis and decades of resignation. Do you want to get well? The paralytic's reply was not an affirmation of desire, but a resigned lament focused entirely on the insurmountable logistical problem. He had no one to help him, no one to carry him down to the water when the crucial stirring occurred, explaining the physics of his failure rather than addressing the core possibility of recovery. He was so conditioned to the process of waiting and failing that he could no longer conceive of an alternative path, trapped by the geometry of the pool and the speed of other people's movements. Without any ritual, physical touch, or even a preamble of prayer, the command was delivered in simple, clear, and unassisted language. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk. An instruction that completely bypassed the need for water, time, or assistance. The effect was instantaneous and absolute, a sudden, complete, physiological reversal of nearly 4 decades of muscular atrophy and nerve damage. The man's limbs received strength, his nerves fired, and he stood upright for the very first time in most of his adult life. He did not merely walk, but he obeyed the second part of the command, rolling up the heavy mat, the bedroll that had been his permanent prison, and symbol of his helplessness, and carried it easily over his shoulder as he walked away through the porticos. The man's overwhelming joy and simple obedience, however, immediately collided with the intricate, rigid machinery of religious law. For the day of his healing was the Sabbath. The sight of a man carrying a burden, his bedroll, on the day of rest was an intolerable affront to the religious authorities, who instantly accosted him, focusing only on the violation of the law rather than the astounding miracle of the cured body. When challenged, the man offered the most simple, unassailable defense. The person who had healed him had commanded him to do it, placing the authority of the miracle above the letter of the law. This tension between instantaneous mercy and rigid legalism highlights the true paralysis of the moment, showing that the physical ailment was easier to cure than the spiritual blindness of the legalistic heart. The healed man, now unburdened and free, eventually found himself confronted once more, told to sin no more, emphasizing the subtle connection between his past ailment and his spiritual health. The remarkable, sudden freedom of this man, finally able to carry his own mat after 38 years of waiting, transitions us to another story of long-term suffering and absolute social isolation, where the barrier to re-entry was not the law of the Sabbath, but the terrifying reality of contagion. From the sterile marble and stone of Jerusalem's porches, we move now to the desolate, uncultivated margins of society, where the most terrifying and irreversible of all ancient maladies held dominion, the creeping, flesh-eating horror of leprosy. This disease, known throughout history as a slow, visible descent into physical ruin, was not merely a medical condition, but a total, absolute social sentence of death, forcing the afflicted into an inescapable, living exile. The weight of this separation was governed by strict, specific religious laws that demanded total and perpetual isolation from all healthy human contact, making the leper an untouchable shadow. His existence was defined by a series of mandatory public declarations of his contaminated status. He was forced to wear torn clothes, leave his hair unkempt, and, most chillingly, whenever approaching any settled area or healthy person, he was obligated to cry out in a rasping, mournful voice, "Unclean! Unclean!" This constant cry was not just an announcement of disease, but a desperate, lonely plea for distance, ensuring that no one could accidentally come near him and incur the ritual impurity that would also force them from the community. The leper's life was an endless loop of profound loneliness, the constant low-level despair of being seen not as a person, but only as a contagious, fading sickness, barred from family, worship, and the simple comfort of human touch. It was one such man, driven by a hope that defied the absolute prohibition of his existence, who approached the central figure as he walked along the road, doing what no leper was legally permitted to do. He came near. He knelt before the Master in a posture of total surrender, his entire demeanor a desperate, silent plea, voicing the single, most critical qualification: "If you are willing, you can make me clean." The leper's request was centered not on the question of the healer's power, which he fully accepted, but on the question of his willingness. The decision to extend mercy to one who was legally, medically, and socially untouchable. The response given defied every purity code, every ancient law of separation, and every instinct for self-preservation. The master stretched out his hand and actually touched the man, laying his fingers directly upon the diseased, decaying flesh. This single, deliberate act of contact was a seismic violation of the established religious order, making the one who touched instantly unclean according to the rigid, necessary laws of the time. Yet the power that flowed from him immediately superseded the law. The command was simultaneously spoken: "I am willing. Be cleansed." And the instant result was a miraculous and complete physical transformation. The spreading, visible decay immediately halted. The skin smoothed, and the living texture of healthy human tissue returned to the body. The healing was total, not only removing the physical symptoms, but reversing the entire process of the disease, transforming the man from a figure of death and contagion into a vessel of pure health. This miracle, however, was not complete until the former leper was restored to his community, a process that required strict religious validation, which is why the man was commanded, "See that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded." This instruction forced the healed man to engage with the very legal system that had cast him out, transforming his healing into an undeniable, bureaucratic fact that the temple authorities had to acknowledge. The offering commanded by the Mosaic law for re-entry was highly specific and symbolic, requiring 2 live, clean birds, some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, symbolizing the flight of the disease and the cleansing power of nature. This meticulous, detailed ritual required the priest to officially pronounce the man clean, marking his formal, undeniable re-entry into the rights and privileges of human society after years of forced social death. The entire event was a profound demonstration of authority over physical decay and social exclusion, replacing the perpetual cry of "unclean" with a quiet certificate of acceptance. This powerful reintegration into the social fabric, overcoming the most visible of physical afflictions, naturally leads us to a story of a far less visible but exponentially more destructive affliction: the control over unseen spiritual forces and the chaos they can inflict upon the human mind and property. Our scene now shifts dramatically across the Sea of Galilee to the rugged, remote eastern shore, a region of steep, unforgiving hills and isolated communities known as the country of the Gerasenes, which was distinctly Gentile territory. The setting itself was unsettling and rough, and the air was immediately heavy with an atmosphere of profound spiritual oppression, which manifested in the form of a man tormented by a multitude of unseen spirits. This man had been completely severed from all human society and lived in the most forbidden of places: the ancient rock-cut tombs, the dark, silent habitations of the dead, making his dwelling a place of absolute ritual impurity. His spiritual torment was matched by a terrifying, superhuman strength that made him a force of nature. Whenever the townspeople managed to bind him with chains and shackles in a desperate attempt to contain him, he would effortlessly snap the metal restraints, scattering the remnants like brittle thread. For years, he had been a fixture of the desolate hillsides, constantly crying out in a chilling, non-human voice and wildly cutting himself with stones. A figure of uncontrolled, agonizing frenzy, feared and avoided by everyone in the region. The moment the central figure stepped ashore, before he had even spoken a word, the tormented man rushed forward and fell down before him, the powerful, frenzied body submitting instantly to a greater, unseen authority. The voice that spoke was not the man's, but a collective, tortured sound emanating from his body, crying out in terror and immediately recognizing the presence of the divine power before them. "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." The immediate, terrifying question from the unseen entities centered on the Master's intent, revealing their deep, primal fear of being permanently expelled from the region or banished to the spiritual abyss. When asked for his name, the chilling reply was not a singular identity, but a military-grade collective. "My name is Legion, for we are many, a vast, uncountable host of spiritual beings that echoed the massive, overwhelming organization of the occupying Roman army." This terrifying declaration revealed that the man's suffering was not singular possession, but a profound and absolute spiritual occupation, involving a multitude of unseen forces inhabiting one human vessel. Recognizing the overwhelming number and their plea, the entities negotiated for an alternative destination, petitioning to be transferred into a nearby herd of swine, a large, valuable commodity being fattened for the Gentile market on the upper slopes of the hill. The Master granted the request with a single, immediate word, "Go," and the massive transfer occurred instantly, resulting in the terrifying sight of the entire herd, numbering approximately 2,000 pigs, being simultaneously and violently seized by the unseen forces. The entire herd, now maddened, immediately charged with unstoppable force down the steep, unforgiving slope of the hillside, rushing headlong into the deep, cold water of the Sea of Galilee, where they all suffocated and drowned in a collective, economically devastating catastrophe. The shepherds who witnessed this terrifying, sudden event fled in absolute terror, running into the surrounding city and countryside to report the complete and simultaneous destruction of the entire herd and the astounding, inexplicable nature of the man's cure. The townspeople, alerted by the panicked shepherds and concerned about the immense, sudden economic loss, came out to see the sight for themselves, finding the former demoniac sitting quietly at the feet of the Master. The sight that greeted them was profoundly unsettling. The man who had been a terror to the region was now calm, clothed, and in his right mind, a picture of perfect, quiet tranquility that contrasted starkly with the raw, horrifying memory of his past violence and the sight of the dead animals. Their reaction, however, was not one of joy or gratitude for the man's restoration, but of profound, overwhelming fear of the inexplicable power that had so violently and expensively disrupted their familiar world, destroying 2,000 head of their livestock. They begged the one who possessed such disruptive, overwhelming authority to immediately depart from their district, prioritizing the stability of their economy and the safety of their predictable lives over the astonishing miracle they had witnessed. The formerly possessed man, now wholly healed and longing to follow his deliverer, was instead commanded to return to his own house and tell his family and community exactly what had been done for him. This miracle, characterized by the destruction of property and the sudden control over vast unseen spiritual legions, was a public, visceral demonstration of authority over the realms of the mind and the spiritual darkness. The sheer power demonstrated here in the physical transfer of thousands of demons now transitions us to a more subtle, yet equally profound demonstration of authority. Power over illness applied not in person, but across a vast and undeniable physical distance. We shift our focus now from the chaotic, spiritual confrontation on the eastern shores of Galilee to a scene of profound human dignity and unusual military authority in the town of Capernaum, where the nature of power and command is completely redefined. The central figure of this story is not a Jewish supplicant, but a Roman centurion, a professional soldier who held the powerful, precise command over 100 men in the disciplined structure of the empire. This centurion's social position was high, a man accustomed to giving orders that were instantly and unquestionably obeyed. Yet he possessed a quiet, deep respect for the Jewish people, and had even funded the construction of their synagogue, showing a rare blend of authority and humility. His immediate concern was not for himself, but for his servant, a male slave who was critically ill, paralyzed by a debilitating sickness, and now lay close to death. The relationship between the centurion and his servant, described as one whom he highly valued, was unusual for the rigid social hierarchy of the time, suggesting a deep, personal affection and sense of responsibility that drove the officer's desperate action. Unable or unwilling to approach the master directly, perhaps out of recognition of his own ceremonial uncleanness as a Gentile, the centurion instead sent a delegation of respected Jewish elders to plead his case, relying on their authority and his previous goodwill to gain an audience. The elders, in their appeal, emphasized the centurion's moral worthiness, vouching for his character and his generosity toward the community, arguing that he deserved the favor not only for himself, but for his valued slave. The master immediately agreed to accompany them, beginning the short journey toward the centurion's house, an acknowledgement of the severity of the illness and the unusual nature of the request. However, as they drew near to the house, the centurion sent a second unexpected group of friends with a stunning message that revealed his unique, profound understanding of spiritual authority, a realization that transcended all cultural and religious barriers. The message urged the master not to trouble himself by entering the house, an act which would have made him ritually unclean according to Jewish law, demonstrating the centurion's sensitivity to the customs of the Jewish healer. The core of his message, however, was a striking metaphor drawn directly from his own professional life, articulating a theological principle with the chilling clarity of a military mind. Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak a word, and let my servant be healed. He explained his logic by stating that he himself was a man under authority, subject to the commands of his superiors. Yet he also had soldiers under him, whom he commanded with absolute certainty. When he told one to go, he went instantly, and when he told another to come, he came without question. And when he commanded his servant to do this, it was immediately done. This was the centurion's ultimate demonstration of faith, a realization that the master's power was not localized, requiring physical proximity or human effort, but was a spiritual command that operated through unseen, instantaneous authority, much like a general issuing an order from afar. The mere utterance of the word he believed was enough, making this request a rare and profound acknowledgement of remote power. The central figure, hearing this message, was astonished, turning to the crowds that followed and stating that he had not found such great faith, not even among the whole of Israel, praising the Gentile soldier's pure spiritual insight. He did not need to proceed to the house, nor did he need to utter a command directly to the servant. The healing was enacted the moment the centurion's faith was acknowledged. When the friends who had carried the message returned to the centurion's house, they found the servant completely restored to health, the paralysis and the illness having vanished precisely at the time the master had spoken, confirming the absolute, non-localized nature of his power. This was a unique miracle, performed solely by the invisible force of the spoken word, demonstrating that spiritual command respects neither physical distance nor architectural boundaries. This focus on remote, absolute authority, controlling an event miles away with a single word, naturally leads us to a story about a display of power over a different kind of distance, the vast, untamable space of the open sea and the unpredictable violence of nature itself. We shift from the quiet, dignified authority of a Roman house to the sheer, terrifying chaos of a sudden tempest. Our journey now returns to the vast, shimmering surface of the Sea of Galilee, a body of water that had already proved its power and unpredictability in the earlier story of the walk upon the waves. On this particular occasion, the disciples and the master entered a boat, intending to cross to the other side, seeking a moment of respite from the relentless, pressing demands of the large crowds that followed them everywhere. The disciples, being mostly native fishermen, knew the character of this freshwater sea intimately, understanding that the topography of the surrounding hills, the deep valleys and high plateaus, created a dangerous funnel for sudden, violent gusts of wind. As they sailed, an immense, unexpected squall suddenly descended upon the water, hitting the small boat with terrifying speed and force, transforming the calm surface into a maelstrom of violent, wind-whipped waves. The boat quickly began to take on water, the rough, heavy sea surging over the low sides, filling the hull and threatening to swamp the vessel completely, creating a genuine, immediate danger of sinking and drowning. Despite the chaos, the boat was a microcosm of profound paradox. While the seasoned, professional fishermen were consumed by panic and physical exhaustion, straining at the oars and frantically bailing water, the central figure was in the stern, soundly asleep on a simple, rolled-up cushion. Imagine the deep, complete trust and exhaustion required to sleep so utterly through the noise of a sudden storm, the crash of waves against wood, and the frantic cries of the terrified men around him. The contrast between his perfect, untroubled rest and their life-or-death panic highlights the profound difference in their relationship to the elements. Finally, consumed by fear and desperation, the disciples, their voices strained and hoarse from fighting the wind, woke him with a fearful, almost accusatory cry. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Their question revealed not just their fear of the physical danger, but a deeper, more agonizing doubt about his attention and concern for their immediate survival. Roused from his deep slumber, the master's response was not a rush of action or a physical effort to stabilize the boat, but a simple, twofold command aimed first at the unseen entities of the air and the water. He rebuked the wind, treating the natural, chaotic force as if it were a conscious, disobedient entity that needed to be silenced. And then he spoke directly to the volatile water, uttering the simple, total command, "Peace, be still." The effect of these three powerful words was instant and absolute, a sudden, complete cessation of all elemental violence. The roaring wind dropped instantly to nothing, and the heaving, massive waves immediately flattened into a smooth, still surface, creating a profound, unnatural silence. The transformation from extreme, violent natural noise to utter, perfect stillness was so immediate and overwhelming that it left a vacuum of sound that must have been far more unsettling than the storm itself. It was the physical manifestation of an undeniable, total authority over the very forces of nature, reducing the raging sea to the perfect stillness of a mirror. After silencing the storm, the rebuke was turned quietly toward the disciples, centering again on their failure of perspective and trust. "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" The question highlighted the incongruity of their panic. They had just witnessed his power over matter and illness, yet they still doubted his ability to command the elements that threatened them. The profound silence that followed the storm was filled with the men's collective, hushed astonishment and a fearful, questioning whisper among themselves. "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This miracle was not performed for a sick supplicant or a begging parent, but purely for the benefit of his own immediate followers, serving as a powerful, terrifying object lesson in who he truly was. The display of absolute power over the vast, uncontainable forces of nature commanding the sea itself now transitions us to a story about a display of subtle, precise power over the tiny, hidden details of the natural world and the financial concerns of men. We move from the immense, terrifying power to silence a storm, to the quiet, almost surreal provision of a single, specific coin found inside the mouth of a common fish. Our final scene focuses now on the return to Capernaum, the small, bustling center of activity where the religious and the mundane often collided, particularly in the realm of taxation and legal obligation. Upon arrival in the town, the collectors of the temple tax, a fixed annual levy of 2 drachmas, or half a shekel, required of every adult male for the upkeep of the holy temple in Jerusalem, immediately approached the impulsive disciple Peter. The collectors asked him a direct, challenging question. "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" This was not merely a query about compliance, but an implicit challenge to the master's authority and his loyalty to the religious institution, seeking to place him within the legal confines of the system. Peter, ever quick to respond and anxious to defend his teacher's reputation, immediately confirmed that he did, indeed, pay the tax, an answer given quickly before he had fully consulted with the master himself. The exchange that followed, however, revealed a deeper, more complex theological argument about obligation and ownership. The master initiated the conversation, by asking Peter a rhetorical question about earthly kings. From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their sons or from others? The obvious answer, that kings tax only those who are not their immediate family or heirs, set the stage for the next logical step. If the temple was his father's house, then the son and those belonging to him were exempt from the tax. This moment articulated a profound spiritual claim of divine sonship, an inherent exemption, placing the master outside the necessary obligations of ordinary men. Yet, in a quiet demonstration of humility and wisdom, the claim of exemption was immediately followed by a decision to comply with the law, choosing to pay the tax not out of necessity, but to avoid causing offense or creating a stumbling block for the community. The solution to this small, practical financial problem was a miracle of such specific, low-key precision that it seems almost surreal. A command of provision that bypassed all conventional human means of acquiring wealth. The instruction given to Peter was meticulously detailed and absolutely unique. Go to the sea and cast a hook, and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a coin, a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. The details of this command are astonishingly precise. The required action was not net fishing, the primary trade of the disciples, but the more singular, focused action of casting a hook, ensuring only a single, specific fish would be caught. Furthermore, the coin specified was a full shekel, precisely the amount needed to pay the 2 half-shekel taxes, covering both the master and Peter with a single act of provision. This entire sequence relied on a staggering coincidence of natural physics and supernatural timing, the absolute certainty that the fauchon, exact fish, carrying the precise coin in its mouth, would be the very first creature to take the hook cast by Peter at that exact moment. Peter, accepting the absurdity of the instruction, performed the ritual of the command, casting the hook into the water, and in a moment of quiet, precise validation, the first fish he caught did indeed hold the exact silver coin required inside its mouth. The coin, extracted from its living, natural container, was a quiet, undeniable provision, demonstrating that the master's authority extended not just to the storms and the sick, but to the hidden contents of a fish's mouth and the intricate logistical demands of human law. This miracle, a display of subtle, perfect control over natural and financial detail, provided a private solution to a small public problem. The image of this unexpected singular provision, a valuable piece of silver found in the most unlikely of places, naturally transitions us to a story about an overwhelming physical provision involving the unexpected resurrection of human life, an abundance far greater than any coin. We move from the quiet, private provision of a single silver coin to the public, profound reversal of an inescapable death. We move our attention from the subtle, hidden provision of the coin in the fish's mouth to a story of raw, physical, and overwhelming abundance on the open water. A miracle that began not with faith, but with deep, professional exhaustion and failure. We find ourselves again on the familiar, fertile shores of the Sea of Galilee, where the working lives of the disciples were centered. Men who knew the rhythm of the waves and the stubborn refusal of the fish. Simon Peter, James, and John along with their partners, had spent the entire long night engaged in the relentless, back-breaking toil of commercial fishing, casting and drawing their massive, heavy nets again and again into the dark, cold water. The night had been entirely fruitless, yielding nothing but water, weeds, and the profound, sinking disappointment that only a wasted night of labor can bring to a working family. Now, with the sun beginning to rise and the fishing hours officially over, the weary men had brought their empty boats back to the shore. The professional failure was compounded by the mundane, laborious task of cleaning the massive hemp and twine nets, spreading them out on the ground to meticulously wash and mend them before the next attempt, a gesture of giving up the chase for the day. This simple act of washing and mending the empty nets was a heavy physical acknowledgement of their failure, a silent statement that they had expended all their skill and knowledge, and the sea had simply refused to yield its bounty. It was at this moment of quiet, defeated resignation that the central figure approached them on the shore, immediately surrounded by a huge, pressing crowd that had gathered from the nearby villages, all anxious to hear his teaching. Seeking a practical, stable platform from which to address the surging multitude, he stepped into one of the boats, choosing the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to push off a little distance from the land. From this floating pulpit, he sat down and began to teach the people gathered on the shore, the smooth surface of the water acting as a natural amplifier for his words, making his voice carry easily to the listening ears of the crowd. When the teaching was finished, the conversation immediately shifted from spiritual instruction to maritime logistics, with the master addressing Simon with a peculiar and highly specific command that completely disregarded the expert advice of the professional fisherman. Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Simon Peter's response was one of profound, respectful, and weary dissent, speaking not out of disbelief in the man's power, but out of the professional certainty of his own trade. Master, we toiled all night and caught nothing. This was the ultimate argument of the seasoned expert, confirming that the window for fishing was closed, the best time had passed, and the water was empty. Yet, the professional failure was immediately overridden by a flicker of undeniable faith and simple obedience, culminating in the critical, pivotal phrase, "But at your word, I will let down the nets." The command was obeyed. The heavy nets were hauled back over the side, and the boat was propelled back into the deeper, less frequented center of the sea. The result was instantaneous and overwhelming. As soon as the nets sank into the deep, they were instantly filled, not with a decent haul, but with a massive, unimaginable volume of fish, so many that the tightly woven nets immediately began to strain, the twine fibers tearing apart under the immense living weight. The sheer physical tonnage of the catch was so immense that it threatened to snap the ropes and break the structure of the nets completely, forcing Peter and the others to frantically haul them back to the boat before they lost the entire colossal abundance. The sheer weight of the surging silver catch was too much for Simon's boat alone, and they had to frantically signal to their partners in the second boat, James and John, to come over and help them contain the overwhelming bounty. Both boats were needed just to contain the catch, and even then, the combined immense load of fish began to settle so heavily into the hulls that both vessels immediately began to sink precariously low into the water, dangerously close to being swamped by the very abundance they contained. Peter's response to this sudden, physical manifestation of authority and abundance was one of sudden, crushing realization about his own spiritual standing. He fell down at the master's knees, not in gratitude for the fish, but in a profound, terrifying acknowledgement of the power he was in the presence of, crying out, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." The miracle was not just about the fish, but about the overwhelming, crushing sense of unworthiness it inspired in the heart of the fisherman, transforming him from a professional into a repentant supplicant. The command that followed was a simple, world-changing instruction that redefined their entire purpose. Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. This transition from the catching of physical fish to the transformation of human lives marked the true beginning of their new calling, turning the failure of the night into the launch of an eternal mission. The disciples, leaving the sinking boats and the massive, glittering, unexplained bounty of fish on the shore, immediately followed him. This stunning display of power over the physical productivity of nature, transforming professional failure into staggering, chaotic abundance, naturally leads us to a story about a display of subtle, careful power over the deep-seated, chronic affliction of the human senses. We shift from the overwhelming sound and sight of breaking nets to the sudden, overwhelming experience of sound and language returning to a silent world. We travel now away from the bustling Jewish centers of Galilee toward the remote, less frequented region of the Decapolis, a federation of 10 Greco-Roman cities on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, a place that was distinctly Gentile and culturally diverse. It was here, in this unfamiliar, non-Jewish territory, that a group of local people brought to the master a man who carried a devastating dual burden. He was both deaf and unable to speak clearly, his tongue and ears having failed him from birth or early childhood. The social challenge of this dual affliction in the ancient world was immense, rendering him completely isolated. Deafness meant an inability to receive instruction, participate in conversation, or hear the central pronouncements of religious and social life, while muteness meant an inability to express the simplest needs or thoughts, locking his internal world away. The friends who brought him begged the healer to perform an action of physical contact, to lay his hand upon the afflicted man, demonstrating their belief that the transfer of power required proximity and touch. The master's immediate action was unusual, gentle, and profoundly personal, designed to overcome the man's twin barriers of communication and sensory loss. He deliberately took the man aside, away from the watching crowd, seeking a moment of quiet, isolated intimacy that would allow the man to focus entirely on the healing process. This separation was an act of profound compassion, allowing the deaf man to observe the actions without the noise or pressure of public scrutiny, providing a quiet space for the strange ritual to unfold. The first deliberate, physical action was highly tactile, bypassing the man's inability to hear. The master put his fingers into the man's ears, a direct, physical engagement with the organ that had failed him for so long, signifying the immediate application of power to the source of the deafness. The second action was equally unconventional and deeply symbolic, one that would have carried great meaning in the ancient world. He spat, and then gently touched the man's tongue with his moistened finger, engaging the organ of speech that had been paralyzed into silence. The combination of spit and touch, strange as it seems, was a deeply personalized, visceral method of communication, allowing the deaf man to feel the healing intent directly upon the instruments of his suffering. Before speaking the curative word, the Master paused, looking up to the heavens in a silent, profound prayer, a groan of deep sympathy, acknowledging the divine source of the power he was about to command. Then, the single, powerful command was issued in the common, immediate language of the region, Aramaic, the language of the everyday, Ephatha. The word itself means be opened, a command directed at the man's inner physical structures, demanding the instant cessation of the condition. The effect of this single word was immediate, overwhelming, and absolute. His ears were instantly opened to the world of sound, and the bond of his tongue was simultaneously released, allowing him to speak plainly and clearly for the very first time. We can only begin to imagine the immediate, shocking sensory overload for the man. The sudden rush of sound, the clamor of the world, and the profound physical realization that his own voice worked perfectly. No longer trapped by the constraints of his own body, he was no longer isolated, but fully reintegrated into the world of speech and reception. The crowd that had witnessed the man's return, though kept at a distance during the direct healing, was utterly astonished, exclaiming that he had done all things well. Recognizing the perfection and completeness of the cure. Yet, the healed man and the witnesses were strictly commanded not to tell anyone what had occurred, a command that was immediately and joyfully disregarded, for the power of the miracle was too great to be contained. The man's restored voice and the people's renewed speech became an undeniable public testimony that the most profound forms of physical isolation could be overcome in an instant. The restoration of this man's senses, allowing him to stand straight and speak fully in the light, naturally transitions us to a story about a public, instantaneous restoration of posture and dignity in the face of long-term, chronic spiritual and physical oppression. We move from the healing of a dual affliction to the single, defining burden of a body literally bent double for many years. Our scene now settles into the familiar, quiet, and highly structured environment of a local synagogue, the central hub for religious teaching and community on the holy day of the Sabbath. Attending the service was a woman whose presence was a silent, profound statement of continuous, chronic suffering, a visual testament to a long-term, inescapable affliction. For an agonizing 18 years, she had been afflicted by what was described as a spirit of infirmity, a condition that had physically and permanently bent her double, leaving her utterly unable to straighten herself up at all. Imagine the visual detail of her existence. Her gaze was perpetually fixed on the ground, her world limited to the dust and the feet of those around her, her body locked into a posture of profound, inescapable humility and constant physical strain. Her inability to stand erect meant she could not fully engage with the world, look anyone in the eye, or participate fully in the rituals of standing prayer and communal worship, making her physical condition a form of spiritual and social disadvantage. The central figure, teaching in the synagogue on this particular Sabbath, immediately saw her among the congregation, singling her out not by her plea or a request from friends, but purely by the evidence of her long, visible torment. The action that followed was one of pure, unsought mercy. He called her forward out of the anonymity of the crowd, bringing her suffering into the quiet, public scrutiny of the assembly. The word of command was not a request for belief, but a simple, direct declaration of liberation. Woman, you are freed from your infirmity. This was followed by the most intimate and personal of healing gestures. He laid his hands upon her, a deliberate, tender touch that carried the authority to reverse 18 years of physical oppression. The result was instantaneous and profound. Immediately, she was made straight, her spine releasing the long, heavy burden of her permanent curvature, allowing her to stand tall and look up at the sky in the faces of the people for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Her response was one of immediate, overwhelming joy and gratitude, and she began to glorify God with a voice full of release and thankfulness, her restored posture matching the freedom of her spirit. The overwhelming, sudden relief of the woman, however, was immediately overshadowed by the public, intense anger of the synagogue ruler, a man consumed by the rigid adherence to the letter of the law and deeply threatened by the disruption of his sacred space. The ruler was filled with indignation because the healing had taken place on the Sabbath, viewing the act of miraculous restoration as a direct violation of the commandment against work. He did not confront the healer directly, but lashed out at the general congregation, scolding them with a legalistic, rigid command. There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. This reaction revealed the tragic spiritual blindness of the religious authority, prioritizing the legal technicality of the day over the profound, life-changing freedom of a suffering human being. The master's reply was a sharp, logical, and unassailable condemnation of this spiritual hypocrisy, addressing the ruler and his allies as hypocrites. He countered their legalism with a simple, agricultural analogy that appealed to common sense and basic human compassion. Does not each one of you, on the Sabbath, untie his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead it away to water? The rhetorical question was undeniable. If they freely performed labor on the Sabbath to relieve an animal's thirst, how much more essential was it to free a human being, a daughter of Abraham, an heir of the covenant, from the 18-year bondage of Satan's oppression? This counter-argument silenced his accusers and caused all those who opposed him to be put to shame, while the entire crowd rejoiced over the magnificent things that were being done. The immediate, physical straightening of the woman, achieved by a word and a touch on a legally forbidden day, was a clear demonstration of the priority of mercy over rigid law, a powerful act of public disruption. This astonishing reversal of long-term, visible suffering in a crowded public space naturally leads us to a story about a public, physical intervention that defies the laws of nature and transforms a moment of deep human sorrow into a celebration of resurrected life. We move from the quiet straightening of a body to the loud, public return of a deceased young man in the midst of a funeral procession. Following the profound, silent healing of the deaf and mute man, our narrative turns to a situation of high social anxiety and physical distance, focusing on a man whose suffering was not his own, but the agonizing helplessness of watching his only child fade away. This story centers on a royal official, a man of significant social standing, likely an important administrator or courtier serving Herod Antipas, whose life was one of public deference and private privilege. However, even his status, his wealth, and his influence were powerless against the single, terrifying reality that his son, back in their home in Capernaum, was desperately ill, rapidly succumbing to a violent, consuming fever that threatened to extinguish his young life. The official's world had been reduced to a single, desperate race against time and geography. Hearing that the one capable of miracles had returned to Cana in Galilee from Judea, a town roughly 20 miles away from Capernaum, the father undertook the long, arduous journey on foot or horseback. This was not a quick visit or a casual request. It was an act of profound public desperation. A high-ranking man, humbling himself to travel a significant distance and approach a wandering teacher whom his peers likely regarded with skepticism. His request was simple, urgent, and focused entirely on the distance. He begged the master to come down to Capernaum and heal his son, because the child was quite literally at the point of death. The official knew that the time required for the master to travel 20 miles was time his child did not have. He needed the physical presence, the laying on of hands, the ritual of proximity. Yet, the initial response he received was not the immediate reassurance he sought, but a quiet, almost probing observation about the nature of belief. Unless you see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. This gentle challenge, however, was quickly overcome by the desperate urgency of the father, who simply repeated his core, non-negotiable plea. "Sir, come down before my child dies." The weight of his grief and the sheer terror of his loss cut through any theoretical discussion, reducing the moment to the raw essence of a father's love and fear. It was at this point that the master delivered the healing command, choosing a method that was deliberately designed to challenge the official's reliance on physical proximity and sight. Instead of agreeing to the long journey, he simply gave a word: "Go. Your son lives." There was no touch, no laying on of hands, no theatrical gesture, and no immediate physical confirmation. There was only the authoritative spoken word, pronounced 20 miles away from the dying boy. The official, despite his high standing and practical administrative mind, performed the ultimate act of faith. He took the man at his word and immediately started his journey back to Capernaum, reversing the path he had so desperately traveled. This return journey was undertaken without the anxiety that had marked his coming. He knew he was still 20 miles away, but the certainty in the teacher's voice, the power in the single, simple command, had instilled in him a strange, profound sense of peace. The entire 20-mile walk home was an exercise in deferred confirmation, a private test of faith over the slow passage of time and distance. The following day, as he was still on the road, getting closer to his home city, his servants met him, their faces conveying a mixture of relief and excitement. The first word they uttered was the joyous confirmation he had trusted. His son was alive, the fever was broken, and he had recovered completely. The official, who had spent the last 20 miles processing a strange, distant hope, now had a new and critical piece of administrative data to verify. He asked them for the exact hour when the change had taken place, the moment the fever had left his son. Their reply was precise, professional, and staggering in its confirmation. Yesterday, at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The 7th hour in the Roman system corresponded exactly to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. which the father immediately realized was the precise moment the master had said to him, "Your son lives." The distance had made no difference. The physical need for presence had been irrelevant. The simple, authoritative word had traveled across the hills and valleys and executed the command with military precision. This stunning, quantifiable proof of healing from a distance completed the man's faith. He believed, and not just he, but his entire household and staff, witnessing the factual reality of the remote miracle. His high social standing, which had initially been a source of pride, was now transformed into a conduit for faith, making the miracle known to many. The healing of the official's son, a private miracle confirmed by public measurement, and the intersection of distance and time naturally prepares us for a story of far more immediate and shocking public discipline. A confrontation with the absolute finality of death in the most visual of settings. We shift from a high fever broken at a distance to a full physical reversal of death in the very heart of a funeral procession. We turn our steps from the busy trade routes of Capernaum and the administrative concerns of the official to the quiet, dusty path leading from the small, secluded village of Nain. The scene is one of profound, immediate sorrow, a moment of tragic finality in the life of a poor woman. As the master and his large company of disciples and followers approached the gate of the small city, they encountered a massive, slow-moving crowd heading outward toward the burial ground. This was not merely a sad procession, but a scene heavy with social tragedy. The central figure being carried was a young man, the only son of his mother, and the mother herself was a widow. In that ancient world, this combination represented the ultimate desolation. A woman who had already lost her husband, the source of her protection and economic security, was now losing her only son, the source of her future and her hope. She was left utterly destitute, helpless, and alone, her grief compounded by the terrifying prospect of her immediate poverty and vulnerability. The large number of townspeople with her showed the community's profound sympathy for her situation, but their presence could offer no real solace or solution to her devastating loss. When the master saw the grieving mother, he was immediately moved with a profound, deep-seated pity, a visceral compassion for her absolute helplessness and sorrow. His first interaction with her was not a request for faith, nor a command for healing, but a simple, tender instruction. Do not weep. This single phrase was an unprecedented interruption of a funeral, an action that demanded the immediate suspension of her grief and the reversal of her expected human response. He then approached the bier, the simple, open litter upon which the young man's body lay, ready for burial. This action was highly provocative, as touching a corpse would render him ritually unclean, but the authority of the moment transcended the technicality of the law. The men who were carrying the bier, sensing the shift in gravity and the sudden, silent command of the moment, stood still, halting the entire slow-moving procession just outside the city gate. The long file of mourners, having reached the point of no return, was frozen in place. It was into this deep, heavy silence of the halted funeral march, with the cold finality of the young man's body lying before him, that the command was issued. It was not a prayer, nor an invocation, but a quiet, powerful word directed straight at the deceased. "Young man, I say to you, arise." The authority of the voice was absolute, cutting through the silence, the finality of death, and the ritual of the morning. The effect was immediate, staggering, and total. The body that was dead sat up on the bier, shocking the pallbearers and the surrounding crowd, and the young man, whose life had been extinguished, began to speak. The master then performed the final, most profound gesture of compassion and restoration. He gave the son back to his mother, reversing her economic and social ruin, and transforming her deepest sorrow into an explosion of public joy. The fear and awe that seized the townspeople was immense and immediate. They had come to bury a son and witness the direct, absolute reversal of death. The crowd was overcome with profound terror, immediately recognizing the event as a visitation of God, a sign that a great prophet has arisen among us, and that God has visited his people. The staggering news of this public, undeniable miracle, which transformed a funeral procession into a celebratory return to the city, immediately spread throughout all of Judea and the surrounding region. The reversal of the procession, the return of the only son to his widowed mother, and the transformation of a devastating end into an unbelievable beginning confirmed the extraordinary power at work. This profound and absolute dominion over death, achieved with a simple, quiet command, naturally sets the stage for an encounter with the divine that is not quiet but blindingly visible and overwhelming. A total, temporary transformation of appearance that takes place far away from the towns and the crowds. We move from the interruption of physical death to the blinding, temporary transformation of the physical form itself. Having witnessed the power to reverse death, our attention now shifts to a revelation of overwhelming, unearthly glory. A moment where the physical form was temporarily altered to reveal the divine essence within. 6 days after a pivotal conversation with his disciples, the Master deliberately took 3 of his closest companions, Peter, James, and John, and led them away from the busy, populated valleys and up onto a high mountain, a solitary, elevated place that provided an escape from the press of the world and a clear space for revelation. As the group settled, the disciples, weary from the climb and the long hours of ministry, began to fall into a deep, heavy slumber. It was while they slept that a profound, quiet transformation took place before their very eyes. The appearance of the Master's face and entire being was suddenly altered, and his robes became dazzling white, intensely bright, and radiating an unearthly luminescence. The whiteness of the clothing was so pure and vivid that no launderer on earth could have bleached them to such an absolute degree of brightness. The very fabric seemed to be composed of pure light. This was not a change of clothing, but a fundamental alteration of appearance, a temporary suspension of his usual human form. Then, as the disciples stirred and woke to this blinding spectacle, they saw that he was not alone. Standing with him, conversing quietly in the dazzling light, were 2 figures of ancient, profound significance, Elijah and Moses. These 2 figures represented the entire foundation of the Jewish faith. Moses, the great lawgiver who delivered the commands from Mount Sinai, and Elijah, the greatest of the prophets who stood for the prophetic tradition. Their appearance alongside the central figure confirmed his place as the fulfillment and culmination of everything that the law and the prophets had foretold. Peter, witnessing this overwhelming convergence of glory and history, and deeply confused by the sheer magnitude of the sight, spoke out of sheer excitement and a desire to capture and contain the moment. He offered a suggestion that was entirely practical yet profoundly misplaced, attempting to ground the divine experience in a human structure. Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, or shelters, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He spoke, as the scripture records, without knowing what he was saying, motivated by a mix of confusion and fear, trying to domesticate the wild, blinding glory he was witnessing. Even as Peter spoke, a cloud suddenly descended upon the mountain, enveloping all 4 figures and the 3 disciples in its deep, luminous shadow. The sudden immersion in the cloud, a traditional biblical symbol of the manifest presence of God, instilled a powerful, paralyzing fear in the disciples. And from the very heart of the cloud, a voice spoke, loud and utterly overwhelming, providing the ultimate, non-negotiable definition of the figure they were beholding. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." The divine command instantly shifted the focus from the glory of Moses and the majesty of Elijah to the singular authority of the one standing between them. As quickly as the vision began, it ended. The cloud lifted and the voice ceased. When the disciples looked up, the blinding light was gone, the robes were normal, and Moses and Elijah had vanished. They saw no one but Jesus only, returned to his normal, recognizable human appearance. As they descended the mountain, the 3 disciples were strictly charged to tell no one what they had seen until a later time, leaving them with the profound, unshared secret of the dazzling, transformative revelation. The sheer, temporary transformation of appearance witnessed on the high mountain, a glimpse of divine glory that manifested as blinding light, immediately sets the stage for a physical change that is far smaller in scope, yet occurs during a moment of supreme physical chaos and violence, a quiet reversal of injury in the depth of a dark night. We move from overwhelming, revealed glory to quiet, almost unnoticed surgical restoration. We now descend from the high, solitary mountain of the Transfiguration into the shadowed, chaotic confusion of the Garden of Gethsemane, a place that was soon to be transformed from a quiet retreat into a scene of sudden, jarring violence and betrayal. The hour was late, the air was heavy with the silence of the night, and the central figure was approached by a large armed detachment. Soldiers, temple police, and servants sent by the high priests and elders, all moving under the cover of darkness to effect a sudden, hostile arrest. In the moments following the profound betrayal of the kiss, the atmosphere was thick with tension, fear, and the readiness for violence. The disciples, confused and terrified by the immediate threat to their teacher, were casting about for any means of defense. It was Peter, the same disciple who had spoken out of turn on the mountain, who made the first, sudden, and violent move. Reacting instinctively to the threat, he drew a sword, a weapon he should not have carried, and swung it hastily toward the nearest available target in the mob. The intended target was not the Roman officer or the temple captain, but one of the high priest's servants, a man whose name, surprisingly, is recorded in the text, Malchus. In the confusion and the darkness, Peter's amateurish, panicked stroke missed the man's neck, instead slicing off his right ear. A sudden, grotesque act of mutilation that instantly transformed the tense standoff into a violent, bloody skirmish. The single, small, physical injury immediately drew a sharp, prohibitive rebuke from the master, who commanded Peter to put his sword back into its place, giving the profound instruction that those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. This moment of instruction, however, was interrupted by a final, small, astonishing act of mercy performed in the midst of the chaos and the dark. Though he was moments away from being bound, arrested, and led off to face trial and death, his attention remained fixed on the man who had been injured by his own follower. He performed a final, immediate miracle, one that was likely missed entirely by the mob and the soldiers who were busy securing the prisoner. The master touched the servant's ear, the severed, bloody wound on Malchus's head, and instantly healed him, restoring the damaged part of the body with a single, gentle, restorative touch. This quiet, almost footnote-worthy miracle, performed on the servant of his fiercest enemy, underscored the central principle of the entire ministry. That power was never to be used for defense or retribution, but always for compassion and restoration, even in the most hostile of circumstances. The ear, the very organ of hearing that had been restored to the deaf man in chapter 15, was now instantly and perfectly restored to the servant, allowing him to hear the words of the arrest and the final instruction to Peter. The immediate, quiet restoration of this small, severed part of the body, performed while being violently arrested by the forces of the law, concludes this sequence of healing and public revelation. This final act of physical restoration in the dark, where a single body part was returned, naturally leads us toward the culmination of the entire story, the greatest physical reversal of all, the complete public disappearance of the body itself from the grave, leading to a story of a missing body and an empty tomb. The sun had not yet fully risen on the first day of the week, the sky still heavy with the gray, uncertain light of dawn, when a small group of women, laden with spices and perfumes, made their way toward the burial site. Their mission was simple, mournful, and practical: to perform the final rites of anointing the body, a duty that had been hastily interrupted by the onset of the Sabbath. They moved with the familiar, heavy resignation of grief, their minds preoccupied with a single, insurmountable logistical problem: the large stone that sealed the entrance of the tomb. It was a massive slab, rolled into a groove and far too heavy for their strength alone to move. Yet, as they approached the garden, their steps slowed and their hushed conversation ceased. The problem of the stone had been resolved without their effort. The earth around the place of burial had been violently shaken, and the immense stone had been rolled away, leaving the entrance gaping open to the dim morning light. Even more astonishing was the presence of the Roman guards, the elite detachment assigned to secure the tomb. They lay on the ground, scattered around the entrance, as though they were dead, paralyzed not by injury, but by a sudden, intense fear induced by the appearance of a being of light whose face shone like lightning. This was the first physical evidence of the cataclysmic event that had just occurred, the terrified helplessness of trained soldiers against a force they could neither fight nor comprehend. The women, in their turn, were met not by the guards, but by two figures in dazzling white, messengers who spoke to the profound dislocation of the moment. They were not there to witness a body, but to confirm an absence with the startling query, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Inside the tomb, the sight that truly confounded the mind and challenged all expectation of grave robbery or hasty removal was the strange, orderly evidence left behind. The linen cloths that had tightly bound the body were lying flat, seemingly undisturbed, yet empty, like a cocoon from which the occupant had simply passed through, leaving the form intact. But the most baffling forensic detail was the napkin, or head covering, that had been placed over the face. This was not found carelessly discarded with the other cloths, nor was it wadded up in a corner. It was folded neatly together in a place by itself. A robber would have frantically stripped the cloth and fled. A hurried removal by friendly hands would have left chaos. But the careful, separate folding of the napkin spoke not of panic, but of leisure, of deliberation, and of an authoritative peace that governed the very act of leaving. When the chief disciples, Peter and John, arrived later, running in confused disbelief, this silent, arranged evidence was the key that unlocked their understanding. John, looking in and seeing the empty, flat-lying bandages, immediately believed. Peter, with his usual directness, went straight inside and saw the same baffling arrangement, the grave clothes lying still, and the napkin folded apart. It was a perfect, unassailable piece of negative evidence. The body had not been stolen. It had simply and quietly vanished, leaving behind only the strange logistics of its passing. The confusion of that bewildering Sunday morning, the terror of the guards, the astonishment of the women, and the silent, baffling testimony of the empty, orderly tomb left the disciples scattered, locked away in their fear, desperately trying to reconcile the impossible reality of a vanishing with the absolute finality of a crucifixion. The news spread like wildfire, yet was immediately dismissed by many as an unbelievable tale told by hysterical women. The very complexity of the evidence, the stone rolled away, the guards in shock, the perfectly folded linen, demanded not a new faith, but a radical reevaluation of every expectation they had ever held. This radical dislocation of certainty, this transformation from hopeful mourners into confused believers, naturally transitions into the private, quiet moment of realization experienced by two ordinary travelers, still attempting to process the baffling reports, setting the stage for a journey where profound truth is revealed to those who cannot yet recognize its source. The shadows of that profound and deeply confusing resurrection day were lengthening as two of the followers, Cleopas and another unnamed companion, walked the approximately 7 miles from Jerusalem to the small village of Emmaus. Their pace was slow, heavy with the weight of the week's devastating events, the hope of the entry into Jerusalem, the trauma of the crucifixion, and now the bewildering, contradictory reports of an empty tomb. As they walked, they engaged in an intense, earnest discussion, going over every detail, every prophecy, and every rumor that had dominated the last 3 days. They were not merely chatting, they were dissecting the total collapse of their world, trying desperately to construct a logical framework from the pieces of their broken hope. It was precisely in the midst of this heated, sorrowful debate that a third traveler joined them. This companion began to walk alongside them, asking what subject they were discussing with such obvious intensity and sadness. Cleopas, astonished that anyone in Jerusalem could be ignorant of the capital's greatest tragedy, replied with a tone of utter disbelief, asking if this stranger was the only person in the city who did not know the things that had happened there in those days. When pressed for details, the disciples recounted the entire crushing story: the life, the mighty deeds, the execution of the prophet of Nazareth, and the total disappointment of their expectation that he would be the one to redeem Israel. They then went on to speak of the incredible, confusing events of that very morning: the women's visit to the tomb, the report of the angels who said he was alive, and the discovery of the empty grave, but the absence of the body. Throughout this detailed, heartfelt recitation of their deepest fears and confusion, the companion listened patiently, and then he began to speak. The stranger's first words were a gentle reprimand, a quiet correction of their slowness to believe the full testimony of Scripture. O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. He then launched into a masterful, comprehensive expository teaching, starting with the writings of Moses and proceeding through all the prophets. He systematically showed them how the entire Old Testament narrative, the whole sweep of their sacred history, pointed toward the suffering, death, and resurrection of the Messiah as a necessary and glorious fulfillment, not a tragic defeat. As he spoke, the disciples felt a powerful, undeniable internal sensation. Their hearts were burning within them, a deep spiritual warmth that attested to the truth and power of his words. Yet still, their eyes were mysteriously held back, and they did not recognize the person who was speaking. The hours of teaching dissolved the miles, and they finally reached Emmaus. The companion made as if he would travel further, but the disciples, enthralled by the teaching and the burning in their hearts, constrained him, insisting that he stay with them. For the day was nearly over. He agreed, and they entered the home to share a meal. It was during the simple act of breaking the evening fast, when the stranger took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, that the long-awaited moment of recognition exploded into their consciousness. It was the familiar gesture, the familiar cadence of his hands and voice, or perhaps the lifting of a divine veil, that instantly opened their eyes. They recognized him. In that staggering moment, their realization was complete, filling their minds with the full, undeniable truth. And just as suddenly as their eyes were opened, he vanished from their sight, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the tangible evidence of the broken bread. The staggering realization that the stranger who had taught them the Scriptures and made their hearts burn was the very person they had mourned sent them immediately rushing back the 7 miles to Jerusalem, filled not with sadness, but with an urgent, explosive joy to tell the remaining, fear-stricken disciples of their encounter. This quiet, personal disappearance, confirmed by the burning memory in their hearts, sets the stage for a total reversal, a sudden, collective appearance to the larger, still doubting group. The disciples were huddled together in a room in Jerusalem, the doors tightly locked for fear of the Jewish authorities. Still reeling from the confusing reports of the empty tomb and the staggering testimony of the two travelers returned from Emmaus. It was a room filled with a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and burgeoning, hesitant hope. Suddenly, without warning, the Master stood in their midst, the locked doors proving no obstacle to his newly transformed presence. His first words were a soothing benediction. "Peace be with you." He then offered them undeniable physical proof, showing them his hands and his side, displaying the very marks of the crucifixion, the wounds that confirmed the continuity between the crucified body and the resurrected one. Joy and relief flooded the room as the disciples finally moved from rumor and hope to absolute certainty. However, one disciple, Thomas, called Didymus, the twin, was absent during this inaugural appearance. When the others excitedly relayed the news, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas's reaction was one of famous, absolute, and almost scientific skepticism. He refused to accept the testimony of their eyes and their collective experience. His demand was specific, material, and entirely empirical. "Unless I see the print of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." He required not just sight, but direct, physical sensation to bridge the colossal gap between a dead body and a living, resurrected form. This was the ultimate demand for proof, a requirement that the spiritual reality be ratified by the most fundamental human senses. A week later, the disciples were again gathered in the same room, the doors once more securely locked, and this time Thomas was with them. Again, the Master suddenly stood in their midst, offering the same tranquil greeting, "Peace be with you." Then, with a profound tenderness that answered the deepest need of the doubter, he turned his attention directly and exclusively to Thomas. He repeated Thomas's exact demands, demonstrating that he had heard the skeptical declaration spoken in his absence, turning the demand for proof into a personal, irresistible invitation. "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side." This was the ultimate moment of confrontation between human doubt and divine reality. The invitation was not a challenge, but a compassionate provision for an honest heart that needed more than words. The specific, personal nature of the invitation instantly shattered Thomas's resistance. The need for empirical proof was met, but the spiritual conviction was immediate. We are not told if Thomas actually touched the wounds, only that the sight and the invitation were enough. Overwhelmed by the tangible presence and the perfect knowledge of his doubt, Thomas did not perform the demanded physical examination. Instead, he collapsed into the most profound theological certainty, uttering the ultimate confession of faith, "My Lord and my God." His doubt was instantly dissolved, replaced by a faith that recognized both the humanity, Lord, and the divinity, God, of the figure standing before him. The final pronouncement of this encounter was not a rebuke, but a beatitude that reached across time and space, defining the faith of all future generations. "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." The resolution of Thomas's doubt, confirmed by the visibility of the wounds and the authority of the invitation, concludes the sequence of resurrection appearances that offer empirical, physical proof. This ultimate confirmation of the resurrected body, proved by the very signs of suffering, now transitions from the theme of the final physical proof of deliverance to the absolute final proof of protection and care that is demonstrated in the ultimate climactic ascension. The storm had finally broken their vessel, casting Paul, the centurion Julius, and the other nearly 300 souls upon the shores of a small, unfamiliar island. The exhaustion of the 14-day ordeal, during which they had been tossed helplessly on the great sea, gave way to the immediate, chilling reality of a winter rain. They learned the place was called Malta, and the native inhabitants, whom the narrative gently calls the barbarians, showed them an extraordinary, unexpected kindness. Recognizing the desperate condition of the shipwrecked, soaked, and freezing travelers, the islanders immediately kindled a great fire to offer warmth and dry their sodden clothes. It was a moment of profound, shared human vulnerability, where distinctions of race or rank vanished before the elemental need for survival and warmth. Paul, ever practical and never one to stand idle, plunged into the collective effort to feed the fire. As the prisoner of Rome, he carried no special privileges, and his strength was needed just as much as any other man's. He gathered a bundle of sticks from the surrounding scrub, an anonymous act of service. As he laid this collection of brushwood onto the already roaring flames, the sudden warmth and light disturbed one of the dormant creatures hidden within the pile. A venomous viper, roused by the heat, suddenly struck out, fastening itself firmly to Paul's hand. The reaction of the Maltese islanders was instantaneous and grim. They knew the lethality of that particular species of snake. They watched the apostle, their faces set in a communal expectation of certain, immediate death. They had seen this before. The deadly poison would course quickly through the victim's veins, causing swelling, pain, and a rapid, inevitable demise. In their minds, they instantly constructed a moral narrative for the event. This man, they reasoned amongst themselves, must surely be a murderer, escaping justice in the sea, only to find it on land. They believed a divine justice, whom they called Nemesis, had finally caught up to him. "No doubt this man is a murderer," they whispered, "whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice has not suffered to live." The islanders expected him to swell up and fall down dead suddenly. It was a prediction rooted in generations of observation and the undeniable laws of nature. But Paul did not swell up. He did not cry out. He felt no pain, and he betrayed no panic. With a calm, deliberate movement that defied all expectation and all natural law, he simply shook the creature off his hand and into the heart of the roaring fire. The viper was consumed, and Paul stood unharmed, continuing his work as if swatting away a harmless fly. The islanders waited. They watched him intently for a long time, expecting any moment for the first telltale signs of the poison to appear, for his hand to darken, or for him to collapse. But as minute followed minute, and no harm came to him, their silent, grim expectation shifted to wide-eyed astonishment. The narrative they had so quickly assigned to him, that of a fleeing criminal, was completely demolished by this extraordinary immunity to death. Their judgment flipped with the same speed, and they began to whisper among themselves that he was a god who walked among them. The miracle of his survival proved not just his innocence, but an inexplicable divine protection. This incident, an unplanned demonstration of supernatural immunity from a natural deadly force, became the catalyst for a much wider witness. The chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, received Paul and his companions into his home with great kindness for 3 days. It was there that Paul's practical, divine power was first used to heal Publius's father, who lay ill with fever and dysentery. The simple act of prayer and the laying on of hands cured the man immediately, proving that the protection that saved Paul from the viper was a power that could be extended to others. The news of this healing spread quickly through the island, and soon all the sick on Malta came to Paul, and they were healed. The power that deflected the venomous strike now delivered the islanders from their diseases. This sudden, staggering display of protection and deliverance, moving from the personal immunity of a single man to the collective healing of an entire community, serves as the final, dramatic proof of the authority given to the Master's followers. Having established this physical reality of divine protection, the narrative is prepared for the ultimate and final act, the ultimate departure into the realm of the unseen. 40 days had passed since the resurrection, days filled with appearances, proofs, and teachings that had solidified the faith and prepared the small, devoted company of followers for their ultimate mission. The last meeting took place not in a closed room, but on the familiar slope of the Mount of Olives, a site rich with the history of his life and ministry, a natural and fitting threshold for his final departure. The disciples were gathered, still filled with human expectations about the future. Their final question, posed in those last moments, concerned the restoration of the earthly kingdom. Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They still clung to the political and national hopes that defined their understanding of the Messiah. His final, gentle instruction did not deny their hopes, but profoundly redefined their scope. He commanded them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, a power that would come upon them in the form of the Holy Spirit. He told them that they would receive this power and would be his witnesses, not just in Jerusalem and Judea, but unto the uttermost part of the earth. The scope was now global, the power was supernatural, and the timing was entirely within the Father's authority. This final, profound redirection of their focus from local politics to a universal mission was the very last thing he spoke before the final, grand mystery unfolded. As he spoke these words, the moment of separation began. It was not a sudden vanishing like the one on the road to Emmaus, but a gentle, visible process. While the disciples watched, fixed on him in complete attention, he was taken up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and visible to all. He began to ascend into the air, rising up from the ground with a quiet, natural majesty, lifted by a power that was utterly his own. It was a physical, public departure, visible proof that his resurrected body was subject to new laws of existence, transcending the force of gravity itself. The disciples were given time to observe every detail of this unprecedented, nonviolent transition. The gradual ascent continued until a cloud received him out of their sight. The cloud was not a shroud, but a quiet, majestic veil, the traditional sign of God's own presence, the Shekinah. It provided the ultimate, silent concealment, removing him from their sight not through trickery or a sudden break in vision, but through a sublime, quiet act of mystery. For a long time after the cloud had taken him, the disciples remained rooted to the spot, their necks craned, staring up intently into heaven as if trying to pierce the luminous veil that had just swallowed their master. Their posture was one of stunned, total fixation, clinging visually to the last physical point of contact they had with him. This moment of suspended attention was broken by the sudden, startling appearance of two men dressed in white apparel standing beside them. These were angels, messengers of clarification and comfort, who gently redirected their focus. The question they posed was simple, yet profound. Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? The question was a gentle command to move from passive wonder to active expectation. They offered a final, confirming promise. This same Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. The angels did not call them to endless staring, but to the promise of a future return. This quiet, nonviolent, and deeply mysterious conclusion to the Master's earthly life provided the disciples with the ultimate moment of peace and certainty. They had witnessed the beginning and the end, the crucifixion and the ascension, and they now understood that their mission was not to wait for him in the clouds, but to work on the earth in anticipation of his promised return. They worshipped him there on the Mount of Olives, not in sorrow, but with great joy, and returned to Jerusalem to await the power they had been promised, completing the final arc of the sleep story with a sense of future expectation and absolute confident peace.